My beloved child. The first thing they did when they heard the news about you was not speak. They simply stared at the person standing across from them, as though the words had entered the room but had not yet reached their mind. For several seconds, they honestly believed they had misunderstood. What did you say? The question came out quieter than they intended. The person repeated it. And this time there was no protection left in misunderstanding. Something had happened to you. Something serious enough that your name had been spoken carefully, with that strange softness people use when they know the next sentence may hurt. Your soulmate felt their fingers tighten around the phone in their hand. They had imagined hearing news about you before. They had imagined someone saying you were happy. That you had moved on. That you were seeing someone else. That you no longer asked about them. Those possibilities had frightened them in ways they never admitted. But this was different. This was not jealousy. This was not wounded pride. This was the sudden realization that while they had been wasting time trying to decide whether they were ready to speak to you again, life had continued moving without asking their permission. And now they were standing there wondering whether they had waited too long. The person who brought the news tried to explain what had happened, but after the first few sentences your soulmate stopped hearing everything clearly. Their mind had already gone somewhere else. Back to the last conversation between you. Not the dramatic parts. Not the disagreement. Not even the sentence that finally made you walk away. They remembered something much smaller. You had been standing near them, tired in a way they had noticed but never asked about, and you said, "I don't think you realize how exhausted I am from pretending this doesn't hurt." They had looked away. That was what returned to them now. Not your anger. Your exhaustion. At the time, they had convinced themselves you were being emotional. They believed both of you needed distance. They told themselves that silence would calm everything down. What they never admitted was that silence had also protected them from having to answer the question you kept placing in front of them. What are we doing? You had never demanded perfection. You had asked for clarity. And clarity was the one thing they were too frightened to give. So they gave you something easier. Confusion. Perhaps you remember how it happened. They would become tender just when you were beginning to accept the distance. A message would appear. A memory would be mentioned. They would say they missed talking to you. For a few days, it felt as if the wall between you had finally cracked. Then the moment the connection became emotionally real again, they disappeared behind that wall. You kept trying to understand the contradiction. How could someone care so deeply one day and act untouched the next? You searched your own behavior for the explanation. Maybe you had asked for too much. Maybe you had been too honest. Maybe you should have waited longer. Maybe if you became quieter, easier, less affected, they would stop pulling away. But eventually something inside you changed. You stopped chasing an explanation from someone who benefited from keeping you uncertain. That was the beginning of the distance they later blamed on you. They noticed it first in your messages. You still responded, but the warmth was different. You no longer carried the entire conversation when they became distant. You stopped rescuing awkward silences. You stopped asking, "Are you okay?" every time their energy changed. Then came the evening they sent you a casual message after several days of saying nothing. They expected the old version of you to answer almost immediately. Instead, hours passed. When your reply finally appeared, it was kind. Simple. Almost peaceful. I hope you're doing well. Nothing was wrong with the sentence. That was why it frightened them. There was no accusation to fight. No emotional paragraph to dismiss. No question they could avoid. Only the unmistakable feeling that you were beginning to learn how to live without an answer from them. They stared at those words longer than they would ever admit. They typed, "Is everything okay?" Deleted it. Typed, "You seem different." Deleted that too. Finally they sent something meaningless, pretending they had not noticed. But they had noticed. And from that moment, they began carrying an uncomfortable suspicion. Maybe the person they were afraid of losing had already started leaving. They still did nothing. That was the part shaking them now. Because after receiving the devastating news about you, their mind was not filled with all the grand things they might have done. It was filled with ordinary moments when they had the opportunity to be honest and chose comfort instead. A call they could have answered. An apology they postponed. A message they read 3 times before leaving unanswered. The day you asked whether they wanted you in their life and they replied, "I don't know what I want right now." What they meant was more complicated. They did know they did not want to lose you. They simply did not know how to love you without surrendering the emotional control they had spent years building around themselves. So they gave you a sentence that sounded uncertain when the deeper truth was fear. You heard rejection. They meant fear. But intention does not erase impact. And now, for perhaps the first time, they understood that. The person standing with them after delivering the news finally asked, "Are you okay?" Your soulmate laughed once, but there was nothing amused in it. No. They sat down. Their leg would not stop moving. Their hands had begun trembling enough that they placed the phone on the table. Then they asked the question they had been afraid to ask. Do they know I know? No. A strange relief crossed their face, followed immediately by shame. Because why should that matter? Why should they care whether you knew they had heard? And yet they did. Part of them was still protecting the same old distance. Even in fear, they were calculating vulnerability. That realization disgusted them. They picked up the phone again. Your conversation was still there. They had never deleted it. They scrolled much farther back than they intended. Past the arguments. Past the hesitant check-ins. Back to a time when neither of you had learned to be careful. And then they found a voice message. They had forgotten about it. You were laughing at the beginning because you had recorded it after trying to type the same story several times. Your voice sounded lighter. Unprotected. You told them about something ordinary that had happened during your day, then somewhere near the end you became quiet and said, almost casually, "I like that I can tell you things that probably don't matter to anybody else." That sentence broke something open inside them. Because they finally understood what had been lost. It was not simply a romance. It was not simply attraction. There had once been a place between the two of you where ordinary things were safe. Your smallest thoughts had somewhere to go. And when the relationship became frightening, they had treated that tenderness as though it were disposable. They played the message again. Then again. The third time, they did not finish it. They put the phone down and covered their face. Someone nearby said their name. They shook their head. I should have called. It sounded almost childish. As though saying it could change something. I should have called them. The other person did not answer. There was nothing to say. Your soulmate stood and walked toward the window, but even there they could not become still. Their mind began constructing every possible version of what might happen next. What if you were afraid? What if you were alone? What if you thought nobody cared? And then came the thought that hurt most. What if you needed them once, and they had taught you not to call? That question did not leave. Because there had been a moment when you did reach toward them. They remembered it now with painful clarity. You had not explained everything that night. You only said, "Can you talk?" They had seen the message. They were irritated about something unrelated, emotionally tired, and still carrying resentment from your previous disagreement. They waited before responding. Not because they could not talk. Because they wanted you to feel that they were not always available. When they eventually replied, "What's up?" you said, "Nothing. It's fine." They allowed the conversation to end there. At the time, they told themselves that if it had really mattered, you would have explained. Now they understood the possibility they had refused to consider. Maybe asking once had already required more courage than they realized. The news about you forced them to revisit that night differently. Not to invent guilt where none belonged, but to finally see the pattern. Every time vulnerability approached, both of you began protecting yourselves. You would reach. They would hesitate. They would reach. You would remember what happened the last time and hold back. Soon neither person was responding only to the present moment. Both of you were talking to old wounds. That was how two people who cared about each other became strangers without either one making a single final decision. Your soulmate opened the message box. For the first time, they did not type something clever. They did not begin with, "Hey." They did not pretend they had simply been thinking about you. They wrote, "I heard what happened." Then stopped. The sentence looked wrong. Too distant. They deleted it. They tried again. "I don't know if hearing from me is the last thing you need right now." That felt closer to the truth. They continued. "I also don't want to make this about me. I just need you to know that I heard, and I'm thinking about you." Their thumb hovered over the screen. Still, they did not send it. Not yet. Because another memory had appeared. The last real argument. You had said something they later described to other people as harsh. "I can't keep teaching you how to care about me." They had become defensive immediately. "I do care." "I know," you said. That answer confused them so much that they stopped arguing. You looked at them for a long moment. Then you said, "That's what makes this worse." They never understood that sentence. Until now. Caring had never been the entire problem. You believed they cared. What hurt was being cared about privately and handled carelessly publicly. Being missed but not chosen. Being important but never secure. Being wanted whenever distance became uncomfortable, then pushed away whenever closeness required responsibility. Their feelings were real. Their behavior had simply failed to carry them. And devastating news has a cruel way of separating those two things. It strips away the stories people tell themselves. Your soulmate could no longer hide behind, "They know how I feel." Because perhaps you did not. Perhaps you only knew how they behaved. And those were not the same thing. They returned to the unfinished message. This time, they added, "You don't owe me a reply. I mean that. I know there were times when you needed clarity from me and I gave you silence instead. I know there were moments I made you feel like caring about me was something you had to apologize for. I'm not writing to fix all of that tonight. I'm writing because I don't want another important moment in your life to pass while I hide behind fear." Then they stopped again. Their breathing had changed. This was the part that frightened them more than the apology. Because honesty meant releasing control over what happened afterward. You might respond. You might not. You might tell them never to contact you again. You might say thank you and nothing more. You might already have reached a place where their confession would not carry the power it once did. And for the first time, they understood that truth was not a tool for getting you back. It was something they owed you whether it benefited them or not. Their finger touched the screen. The message was sent. Nothing happened. No immediate reply. No sign that you had read it. They placed the phone down, walked away, then returned less than a minute later and checked again. Still nothing. That was when another person in the room said something your soulmate did not expect. "You know they used to ask about you." Your soulmate turned. "What?" "Not recently. Before." They waited. The person hesitated, realizing they had already said enough to change the room. They would ask whether you were okay. Even after everything. They never said much. Just asked. Your soulmate looked down. "Why didn't you tell me? Would it have changed anything?" The question landed harder than accusation. Because they did not know. Maybe they would have reached out. Maybe they would have used your concern as reassurance and then retreated again. Maybe they were not ready then. For once, they did not rewrite the past into a more flattering version. "I don't know," they admitted. That answer mattered. There was humility in not pretending they had always been one realization away from becoming better. Change had come slowly. Too slowly for you. Perhaps the news about you did not magically transform them. Real people rarely change in a single evening. But it interrupted something. The comfortable belief that there would always be another opportunity. Another conversation. Another season. Another day when pride would be smaller and courage would be easier. They finally saw how dangerous that assumption had been. You had both been living as though unfinished things remained available forever. They do not. Sometimes people leave. Sometimes circumstances change. Sometimes an apology arrives after the person who needed it has already learned to live without it. Sometimes love survives and still loses its chance. And sometimes frightening news does not create love at all. It simply exposes the love that fear had been hiding. Your soulmate checked the phone again. This time, the message showed that you had read it. Their entire body became still. No response appeared. A minute passed. Then another. They began imagining what you were thinking. Were you angry? Were you crying? Did the message irritate you? Did it comfort you? They almost sent another one. almost returned to the old habit of trying to control silence the moment it became uncomfortable. But they stopped. You did not owe them emotional reassurance simply because they had finally found the courage to be honest. So they waited. Not dramatically. Not peacefully either. They waited with the discomfort of someone learning a new kind of love, the kind that does not demand immediate relief from the person it once hurt. Then your reply appeared. It was shorter than they hoped. Longer than they feared. I saw your message. Your soulmate read those 4 words several times. Then another message came. I don't know what to say yet. Their hands started shaking again. But this time, the shaking carried something different. Not hope exactly. Not relief. Something more sober. Reality. You were there. You had heard them. And the story between you had not magically repaired itself just because they finally told the truth. There were still consequences. Still memories. Still trust that could not be restored by one emotional night. But there was also no longer silence pretending to be an answer. Your soulmate typed carefully. You don't have to say anything yet. They stared at the words before sending them. Then, for once, they added nothing else. No question. No request. No hidden pressure. Just space. And perhaps that was the first genuinely different thing they had done. The devastating news about you frightened them because it forced them to imagine losing you before they had ever had the courage to become honest. But what stayed with them afterward was not simply fear. It was the understanding that people cannot keep postponing tenderness and expect life to preserve it untouched. There are conversations that become harder each time they are avoided. There are apologies that lose meaning when they are used only to prevent someone from leaving. And there are moments when loving another person requires accepting that their healing may not include the outcome you want. Your soulmate had not yet earned another chance. They knew that now. Perhaps that knowledge was more important than all the dramatic promises they once might have made. Because instead of asking you to forget the past, they were finally willing to face it. Instead of saying, "Trust me," they understood that trust would have to watch what they did next. Instead of saying, "I've changed," they would have to tolerate the long, uncomfortable process of proving whether change was real. And you, my beloved child, did not have to make a decision immediately. The news that shook them did not erase what you had lived through. Their fear did not become your obligation. Their realization did not create a debt. Whatever happened next would have to be built differently from what came before. Perhaps there would be another conversation. Perhaps you would eventually tell them what that night of silence had cost you. Perhaps they would listen without defending themselves. Perhaps some things could be repaired. Perhaps some could only be understood. But for the first time in a long while, neither of you needed to pretend the past had meant nothing just because it had hurt. Your soulmate sat with the phone beside them after your last message. They did not sleep easily. Every few minutes, some forgotten moment returned. A look. A sentence. The way you once reached for their hand without thinking. The way you eventually stopped. The memories no longer felt romantic. They felt instructive. Because the part that shook them most was no longer the possibility of losing you. It was finally recognizing how many times you had quietly asked not to be lost in the first place. And somewhere inside that realization, something in them became still. Not healed. Not forgiven. Not reunited. Simply honest. For now, that was where the story needed to remain. With a message sent. A reply received. A silence no longer being used as punishment. And two people standing on opposite sides of everything that had happened, finally understanding that whatever came next could not be built from fear disguised as distance. If there was still a road between you, it would not open because one frightening moment forced them to panic. It would open only if the person who once disappeared when love became difficult learned how to remain present after the fear had passed. And that answer would not be found in what they promised while they were shaking. It would be found in what they chose to do when their hands became steady again.